two, one, and welcome everybody to Ring of Fire Con. And here we are today with our solo panel with the amazing Jonathan Maberry. Jonathan, you have an amazing life, if I may say. I mean, I read your bio, and even, you know, we know each other, but I keep on discovering new things like the Martial Arts Hall of Fame and so on. So with your entire body of work, I mean, you've written for horror, you've written for science fiction, you have written books on self-defense and judo. If I am
judo, I've done both.
Judo and jujitsu. And I mean, you graduated from one of my alma maters, which is Temple University, which is amazing. So tell me, I mean, in terms of your horror work, we'll start there because that's really is that where you started, or did you start elsewhere?
It's where I started my fiction career.
Okay.
I was doing nonfiction writing since 1978, since I was at Temple School of Journalism, selling magazine features, about 1,200 of those, and reviews and columns and all sorts of stuff. Even wrote greeting cards for Hallmark. Yeah, I've had a weird career, but I launched my fiction career in 2006 with Ghost Road Blues, the first of a horror trilogy for Kensington.
Excellent. And Ghost Road Blues, is that like I said, you have an interesting way of folding your passions into your horror books. So Ghost Road Blues, tell me a little bit.
Well, there's backstory to Ghost Road Blues. I'll give the quick version of it. After having done a whole bunch of martial arts and self-defense books, I had one nonfiction book left open on a contract with a small press. And instead of doing another martial arts book, I pitched a book on the folklore of supernatural predators, vampires, werewolves, and so on around the world throughout history. And the publisher was afraid that my martial arts readers, who, you know, I had some level celebrity in the martial arts world, was afraid that they would think I'd gone nuts suddenly writing about vampires. So that was published under the pen name of Shane MacDougall, and the Vampire Slayer's Field Guide to the Undead. And it stoked restoked a childhood interest in not only monsters, but the folkloric versions versus, let's say, the Hollywood versions. Right. So I wanted to write a book where people encountered the kinds of werewolves and vampires that show up in folklore that are substantially different than, say, the Dracula model, or, you know. And just on a lark, I decided to give it a try. I was never drawn to fiction before. And started writing Ghost Road Blues. It took me about 4.5 years, about 3.5 years actually, from the time I started writing it to finishing it. So it was a long time, a lot of revisions, ton of research. I had never taken a creative writing class. I had taken only nonfiction. So I had to teach myself. And what I wrote was an American Gothic horror novel about a small town in Pennsylvania that has a reputation for being the most haunted town in America, just like the town of New Hope, on which it's loosely based. And that it turns out it actually is, I mean, really that haunted. And even though they build their tourism around it, and it's a lot of fun, big Halloween celebrations, turns out it's kind of like a Hellmouth and Buffy in that bad stuff is going to happen there. And it does, and involves werewolves, ghosts, and vampires. And
interesting.
When I finished the first draft of it, which was, you know, pretty monster sized, I knew I wanted to continue the story. So I just kept writing Dead Man's Song and Bad Moon Rising while looking for an agent, and bam, suddenly we had our horror.
You mentioned folkloric vampires and folkloric werewolves and so on. Where did you learn all of that? Because you also appear on television talking about like folkloric versions of zombies and werewolves and so on.
Yeah, I was on 2 TV shows on the History Channel, Zombies, A Living History and True Monsters, talking about that. But my interest started when I was a kid. My grandmother was pretty much an old lady version of Luna Lovegood, you know, the character from Harry Potter who believed in everything. That was my grandmother. She believed in everything, and she was about 1 million years old. I mean, she was 40 when she gave birth to my mother. My mother was 41 when I was born. So she was 81 when I was born in 1958, which means she was born in the 19th century, which is freaky. you know, and she had all the rural influences. But aside from her wide open belief system, she also had a great interest in folklore, mythology, and the psychology of beliefs. So she
Huh.
encouraged me to not only know the monsters that people believed in, but try to understand why they believed in them. You know, sometimes it was a straight scientific explanation, like, you know, werewolves. A lot of the werewolf beliefs came out of trying to understand what we now call serial killers, because most werewolves did not turn into wolves. They acted like a beast. And all that stuff about, you know, the full moon and all that was put in books and movies later on. That nothing to do with folklore werewolves. Same with vampires. You know, vampires in folklore are not afraid of the cross. They don't have to be invited into the house. They're not afraid of sunlight, except the Chinese Jingsha vampire. They are not killed by a stake. A stake is used to hold them down while they're decapitated. And even Dracula wasn't staked. He was stabbed to death.
He was stabbed to death with a silver knife, if I remember.
Nope. Straight Bowie knife and a kukri knife. No, nothing fancy about the blades. They just knifed him to death at the end of the book.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So the most people, what they know about vampires and werewolves comes from books and movies. My grandmother wanted me to know, you know, the whole story of it, and that inspired that nonfiction book. And it's inspired a lot of what I've done with folkloric monsters in my various short stories, comics, and novels.
Awesome. And that's true, because and I just have to point out that I find that fascinating, the folklore aspect of things, because one thing that I've noticed, you know, I travel around a lot, and so do you, is that America is steeped in almost occult mythology, but it's always regional occult mythology.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, traveling through Pennsylvania, you see a sigil on a barn, and I never knew what those were. I just thought they were just neat until I discovered their Germanic folklore magic.
Yeah.
You know, and
well,
then
used by the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Amish, because they carry that as part of their culture.
Yeah, and that essentially all of this has gone on. I mean, for instance, I live not far from the most haunted road in America in New Jersey, which, you know, or at least it claims to be. And you know, ghost stories and all of that, you know, are immersed in our culture. And you have actually translated some of that out, not only to your books, but also to your comics as well.
Yeah. And I love doing that. It's the sort of thing that allows me to write a richer story, because there are little points on it that people will resonate because they've heard about it somewhere else. And it kind of reinforces the reality of the story and helps suspend its belief if it's connected to something they've heard of, even if it's an urban legend or something. Like I've got a novel planned for probably 2022 about the Jersey Devil, which was one of my favorite bits of folklore. I spent every summer camping in the Jersey Pine Barrens near the Batstow area. Steeped in folklore and mythology about one of the most frequently cited monsters in America. Yes. You know, I love drawing on the Americanized version of folklore, things that are either native to American belief systems, or that maybe have come over with settlers and become Americanized. Just as folk music, like Irish, Scottish, and so on, music has become Appalachian music and so on. Yes. But the cultures and the stories behind them get steeped into American soil. And that is a very rich and fertile ground to grow a spooky story from.
That's amazing. And now you mentioned both your work in 2022. You're amazingly prolific, because you were saying before this panel started, you're on your 4th book this year almost.
Yeah. Well, I'm on my 38th novel since 2006. During that time, I've also written 22 runs of comics and 120 short stories. I am in that group of writers called high output writers. Kevin Anderson, Rachel Kane before she became sick, and a few others are in that group of people who, you know, we like the fast lane. That's not only where it's most comfortable, but it's often where we write our best stuff. Every writer is different. I have a buddy who writes one literary mystery every 3 years, and that's his fast lane. That's the lane he likes driving in. So it's not a competition for output. It's just I'm happiest when I've got one project after another. So this year, it's actually the busiest year of my career. I wrote the novel Ink, which will be out in November. I mean, so I finished it this year and wrote it this year, and it'll be out this year. I wrote a shorter novel, 50, 60,000 word range novel for, which I can't tell you what it's about. It's under non-disclosure agreement, but that may form the basis for a TV series. That's a prequel to a science fiction film from a while ago. I wrote that under contract, and I'll be doing the show Bible for it too. That will, include future stories in print, future, and hopefully the TV show. I'm just about to finish Bewilderness, which is a 90,000 word novel broken into 3 parts for Audible, and it's straight science fiction. But I've also written 2/3 of the next Joe Ledger novel, Relentless. So as soon as I finish Bewilderness, I'm going to jump in and hopefully finish Relentless by the end of October. And then I start my first epic fantasy novel, Kagan the Damned.
All right. So first of all, let's go with Ink, because Ink, you on your social media, you have been rather free talking about Ink. And I think the entire idea is fascinating. I think that the audience would love to hear about it.
Well, Ink is quickly becoming one of my favorite things I've done. It's a rare standalone. Most of my books are parts of series. And even though there are characters in it from my Ghost Road Blues books and so on, and other books, it is intended to stand alone. No prior reading is required. But the central conceit is that there is a person who he's able to touch you. If you have a tattoo and he brushes it, the tattoo begins to fade from your skin and shows up on his. And if there are intense memories associated with it, like one person loses the tattoo of her dead daughter, he then relives those memories and feeds on them. And then the person who lost the memories loses them forever. So one character is losing forever the memory of her murdered daughter, and she's only left with the awareness of its vacancy in her heart.
Absence.
And that is it's kind of a terrifying thing, because a lot of the people I've interviewed for Ink who got tattoos got them because it anchors them to something that really matters.
Yes.
There's one person I met who becomes a character in the book who was a Vietnam vet, and everything bad he went through in his life, all the stuff in Vietnam, the death of his mother and so on, is tattooed on his back, but everything on his chest is stuff he wants to do, like happy memories.
Yeah.
So his back, he's walking away from bad and walking toward good. But what if the good memories are stolen and all he's left with are the bad? So it's that kind of a story. And the character's named Owen Minor. He calls himself the Lord of the Flies for reasons that are particularly creepy in the book. And comes out November 17th. I am absolutely delighted that they're doing this. And the publisher has this cool thing where if you, on my page, my Facebook or Twitter pages, there's a link. If you pre-order it through any of the booksellers listed there, and there's most of the big ones, you get a page of temporary tattoos, original for the book.
Oh God!
Yeah,
that's
so it's
amazing. And that's also what I've noticed about is that you do visceral horror, but you do visceral horror from a psychological perspective almost.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of, it's how I'm wired, because it's what I read. I don't read event-based fiction. I read character-based fiction, characters caught up in events. So it's really the wishes, the dreams, the goals, and the cost for each of the characters. So going deep into the psychology of the characters is what makes me want to write stories, and it draws me to the types of stories I read. So it's all about the character experience, and it's often why the books are long, because I want time to cultivate the characters, give them backstory, give them depth before I then go in and completely mess with their lives. We want to know who they were before the crisis of the story happens, so that we understand the cost to them, but also what they have to overcome, what they gain from overcoming those things, if they do.
Excellent. All right. And now you also mentioned in TV, and just recently, one of your books got made into a TV show. What is it? I want you to tell me about that, and I also want to tell you to tell me about the experience of that.
Well, that was V-Wars. V is in vampire. And it was a science fiction take on vampires. There's nothing supernatural in the stories. It's a genetic disorder triggered by an ancient disease trapped in polar ice that melts. And it was done as a shared world anthology for IDW publishing first, where I wrote a 20 or 30,000 word framing story, and then invited other readers to come in and do field reports as this outbreak is happening. And we did 4 volumes of that, plus I did a run of the comics. And the IDW around that time formed a new division called IDW Entertainment, where they essentially became co-owners of the material because it was written for them. And then they would go out and shop it as producers. So it wound up, after several years of hit or miss, it wound up on Netflix for a season, only 1 season, but we did really well. We were #1 in 131 global markets.
That's nice.
Yeah, I know. We had 27 million people watching it. But unfortunately, a little bit of internal politics between them and Netflix and IDW, and also COVID, kind of crashed that a bit. So right now, the star of the show, Ian Somerhalder, who was in Vampire Diaries, he and I are shopping it around to other networks to get a new home.
Interesting.
And if we get a new, one of the things we want to do is go much, much harder and more aggressive into the social politics of intolerance and hatred that you would have if suddenly there was a new species emerging.
All right. And that sounds amazing, because I did watch V Wars on Netflix, and I loved it. And it was an interesting take because, like you said, it was scientific, but also you had a lot of horror in there just from what is happening to these people, and they're unaware, they being unaware of what is occurring. I mean, at one point, and not to give spoilers away, a husband having to handle the loss of his wife, not because of death, but because of an affliction.
Right.
How do you come up with that, and the social dynamics of everything that has occurred from that, both from the government, from a subculture, and from a societal view?
Well, I've written quite a bit about the transformative process of disease. I've written a lot of body horror stuff like zombie stories and so on. And often when somebody gets a disease, and mind you, this was written way before COVID, somebody gets a disease, if the disease is felt to be a personal threat, not only is there the loss of connection with that person because they're now becoming something else, but they've become the other to us, and they become a threat. It's kind of not much different than when a family, like when I was younger, my sister came out as gay to my parents. This is back in the early 70s. And the reaction from my parents was very angry, very violent, and she was pushed out of the family because she was who she was. But they couldn't accept that. Yeah, they could not accept that because it was not who they needed her to be for their worldview to fit correctly. Well, in now we see this a lot with the people with and without masks, the people who
yes,
decide that maybe, hey, I may not buy into the whole COVID thing, but let me wear a mask just in case because I have a little compassion. Those people seem to be in the minority, and a lot of folks are out there saying it's an infringement of your rights. A little piece of cloth is not an infringement of your rights. Get the hell over it. Compassion takes a back seat to laziness, to this completely distorted view of what personal rights are, and so on. And it becomes politicized, which it shouldn't be. It's, these are diseases. I've always known that politics will play a part in any disease outbreak, and as it has over the years, going back to World War I or just after World War I with the Spanish flu. We do that because that's the pettiness built into politics. So I wanted to explore a lot of these different things in V Wars, and we did it. We went real deep in the books with this. And if we get onto another network, Ian Somerhalder and I, we have plans for going very deep, pulling no punches, basically doing for the infection mentality what Watchmen's doing for race issues.
Okay.
We want pull no punches, and we think we'll find a home for it.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it because, first of all, it's a timely subject matter, and second of all, I'll be honest. I mean, the first season was amazing. And if you haven't watched it, ladies and gentlemen, I highly recommend you do, because it's really well done. And also, there being, I mean, for instance, I noticed that at one point, there are subtle differences even within the vampires themselves.
Well, yeah, because in world culture, there are hundreds of different types of vampires. And granted, we're talking about the folkloric supernatural versions in folklore, but if they were, if the folklore was based on a primitive person without a great education trying to interpret what they saw, you would have monsters. But like the vampire in Poland is different from the vampires in France, than they are in Peru, or almost every country has some kind of vampiric beliefs, whether it's a physical vampire or a spiritual presence, or like Eastern Europe, for example. They talk about the Nosferatu, which is a term that Bram Stoker completely got wrong in terms of translation. He said it meant undead. It doesn't. It means plague carrier, because in Romania and that area, there are no physical vampire legends in Romania. There are vampires that are variations on the Strigoi, the evil ghost, that come at night and take your health, take your breath. And we can read into that sudden infant death syndrome. We can read into that night terrors and night paralysis, sleep paralysis, and so on. But those regions had those types of monsters. So, in the melting pot of America, you'd have all these different genetic strains. Somebody could come up as a vampire that's maybe a Ukrainian type, or somebody could turn into a vampire that's a Brazilian kind, or somebody could be a melting pot vampire with qualities from both, and you don't know what they're going to be when their powers and whatever personality changes manifest, and that gives us a lot of creative freedom.
And it does also create. I mean, we've already seen the reaction to, as you put it, the other. Oh, that person. Do they have it? Do they not have it? Oh my gosh. Now, interestingly enough, you have done young adult horror, which I find fascinating, because, young adult horror, because your Rot and Ruin series can be viewed as is very much a young adult horror. But tell me about it, because you took a very interesting, there are plenty of zombie books out there. This one took a kind of a different turn. Can you tell me?
Well, first off, Rot and Ruin is a young adult series, but there is actually an adult series called Dead of Night that is the prequel to it. Explains how the zombie apocalypse happened.
Oh, neat.
And that was the first book in that series was George Romero's favorite zombie novel, Dead of Night. So he one of the things we talked about, because we worked on a project together, is he said that he wished he could have that as the backstory to Night of the Living Dead, because it makes his zombie plague make sense scientifically.
Interesting.
So Rot and Ruin is the same plague. So George Romero said, well, that's what happens 14 years after Night of the Living Dead. So it's the unofficial sequel to Night of the Living Dead, which is, but
that's awesome.
Yeah. The premise of Rot and Ruin is growing up 14 years after the zombie apocalypse. Most of humanity's gone. There's still a whole lot of zombies out there that are not decaying for some reason, which is later explained. There are 9 little towns, gated communities in Central California, and as far as they know, that's it. That's the end of the world. All the adults lived through the apocalypse, and they all have one level of PTSD or another. So they saw their world and every structure within that fail and die during the zombie apocalypse. The kids are growing up after that. This is their world. So their world hasn't failed. Their world, they're alive in that world. They just want to find a way to have a future. So they have a completely different take on it. And one of the things I did when I sat down to work on that is, I'm a very practical person, very pragmatic in my approach to things. I don't like plot devices that don't make sense. It pisses me off. So I went through that story to figure out what would a practical person do in this circumstance. That's why in some of my zombie fiction, you see people come up with solutions to a zombie attack that, seem practical. Why didn't anybody think of that? Because most often when they write a zombie story, they want everyone to be completely vulnerable, as opposed to showing the range from vulnerability to smart. Like, you get a handyman during a zombie apocalypse, he's not going to nail boards crookedly across a door. He's going to reinforce that structure.
The door, yeah.
Safe. You get somebody who's had some time in a military thing, or an ER doctor, or somebody who's known to be an on their feet problem solver. They're not going to just hole up and wait to die, and they're not going to do
No,
something like argue until they all become vulnerable. So
no.
I explored it.
Try to look at various points of approach and attack and so on and so
Right.
forth.
Just like, I mean, we were in season 10 of The Walking Dead, and I love the show, don't get me wrong. But why are only 1 out of 6 people wearing body armor? Well, how come basic hygiene has never played into that? Like, they cover themselves in zombie blood. They've already established that zombie blood is infectious. You're telling me none of these people have any small cuts on their skin that the zombie blood could infect? That's an illogical absurdity. So in things like in Rot and Ruin, we have like people wear carpet coats if they go outside. You can't bite through carpet. And a zombie with rotting dental ligatures is not going to be able to bite through it anyway. So you're safe out there. They use a chemical called cadaverine, which is a real thing, which is what they use to train rescue dogs or cadaver dogs to find dead bodies or rotting bodies after a plane crash or something. People douse that on themselves so they smell dead. Little practical things. Locking themselves in their bedrooms at night because what if somebody dies in their sleep? You don't want that person wandering around killing everyone. So the book has a lot of little practical solutions that any group that is going to survive long term will absolutely have had to come up with, or they would not have survived.
Interesting. And I mean, I thought you're correct, because when I read those books, I'm like, no, that makes absolute sense. And the kids have actually kind of adulterated themselves to the world that they live in, which I find fascinating, because I see that, I mean, we're living in the plague times now. I see that with my own children, where, they will remind each other, don't forget to take your masks, don't forget to wash your hands, etc., etc. And the kids in this world have adapted to that. Where did you think of that?
Well, drew on my own childhood, because I grew up in a very abusive home with a violent, abusive father and a mother who was just enabling bad behavior. Grew up in a lot of poverty and in a neighborhood itself that was very violent. So I had to grow up fast and be self-sufficient. I started studying martial arts on the sly on my own, with my buddy and his dad, because I knew that I was going to have to get tough enough to get out of that house in that neighborhood. I problem solved for me because I couldn't rely on the adults in my life to provide problem solving and answers. So when you have kids, around, let me go at that from a different direction. When kids are left to their own, when there's not an adult who is clearly being the authority and problem solving figure, the kids will demonstrate very quickly how smart they are, how quickly they can solve their own problems. May not always be right, but adults aren't always right. And I grew up I ran with a pack of kids who, we all came from these kinds of homes, and, we self-censored stuff we didn't want to watch or read because, if it wasn't for us, we didn't do it. We became strong. We became self-confident. Doesn't mean that becomes your defining character your whole life, but it's how kids toughen up when they have no choice. If you look at kids in any war-torn country, they've learned to do all sorts of things. Kids in really poor areas, like you look at the kids in some of the African tribal areas, or down in Brazil where there is no technology coming to help them. The kids can hunt, clean fish, build, make clothes because they have to. It isn't that kids are stupid. It's kids are often coddled and not allowed to develop their own set of strengths. And in Rot and Ruin, we explore, if all the parents have lost faith in the future, then it's up to the kids to find a way for them to move forward. And since no one's helping them, they have to become strong enough to do it themselves.
Interesting.
Yeah. And by the way, the 7th and last book of the Rot and Ruin series comes out November 3rd.
Oh, very nice.
The film, it's in development for film right now with Alcon Entertainment, the people who did Blade Runner 2049. They do The Expanse. And there's a webtoon version of it, which is a comics formatted for your cell phone. And it has 315,000 subscribers for the Rot and Ruin webtoon.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I know, it's nuts.
That's really cool. Um, and then you also, I mean, you've written in science fiction because your Joe Ledger series. I mean, the way that I describe that is essentially if Jack Bauer had to take on mad scientists.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about that, because that I find fascinating, because each one is a different mad scientist.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a science junkie, always have been, and uh, I wanted to do a zombie novel, having done research on a nonfiction book called Zombie CSU on how the real world might react to it. And while I was researching that, I talked to a lot of special ops guys and SWAT team and so on about how they would deal with something like zombies, and they had really practical suggestions. So I started thinking like, well, what would it be if there was a tier one special ops group up against the zombie apocalypse? But to do that, it couldn't just be the type of zombies we see everywhere else, because why would a tier one team be put against that? So I come up with an idea of a pharmaceutical magnate who creates a prion disease based on fatal familial insomnia, an actual disease where once you get it, you can never fall asleep again. They weaponize that. Yeah, it's an actual thing. It's scary
That's
as hell.
horrifying.
And the person just wears out and eventually dies. So what I did is I talked to molecular biologists, infectious disease experts, and so on, to come up with a prion-based bioweapon, an engineered weapon that would create a zombie-like plague. And the threat of it, the exposure rate, the infection rate would be so high that they would have to shut it down immediately, and that would bring in a tier one team. So that was originally written as intended as a standalone, but the publisher wanted two more. So I had to come up with what my next plots are. And the second one, I thought, well, since I had done so much research with genetics, how about transgenics, where they combine genetic patterns to create a new chimeric life form, and for a number of different reasons within the story. And third one dealt with weaponized Ebola, but also gaming the stock markets by planning terrorist attacks, because as soon as there's a terrorist attack, we know the stock market is affected. If you're positioned to buy on the lows, you profit from that. So if you know exactly when the hit's coming, But each book became a different field of science. I didn't want to retread anything. I've done all sorts of diseases. I've done uses of drones, GPS hacking, nanotechnology, and it's fun because with each book, I get to talk to another group of experts and pick their brains on what's the worst that could happen. Anytime the science is really good, it's because I talk to the right people. It makes me as a writer look really, really smart. But the smart part comes to talking to the right people and then integrating that with your story.
Well, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm currently writing the 12th. I will be getting back to that, Relentless, which deals with cybernetics and also chemical treatments to amp up different types of qualities. Like one set of chemicals used to make people in third world sweatshops work 36 hours without fatigue. Another group making soldiers amped up so that for a short period of time they're like berserkers, they're supermen. And this is based on existing technologies.
Oh my God. I mean, and I find it fascinating because when you said that, and the research being so good, there's an ongoing joke with, I think, almost every writer I've interviewed here, which is that, we're all on some sort of FBI watch list somewhere because, or NSA or something, because it's like, delete our Google history, but,
I assume that I'm on one of these things because I've also done some consulting work with the government. I had a plot that a buddy of mine was involved in Homeland Security in a team that they do these training weekends where our spec ops groups, but also groups from our allies come and work out scenarios. So there's a response protocol on file, and they leased one of mine because they couldn't beat it. And
nice.
When I say lease, that's your tax dollars, thank you. But me signing a non-disclosure agreement saying I can't ever use that plot for 99 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and there are think tanks like this where they have people come up with all sorts of plots. My buddy Brian Keene, who's one of the top zombie writers, is in part of a CIA think tank.
Huh.
So a lot of us are involved in that, and our search histories have to be. It's like in my novel Assassin's Code, I'm not only dealing with genetically engineered assassins, I'm looking for the nuclear power and like doing Google search on the nuclear power plants in Tehran, where the locations of police buildings are, ground street maps of the city and so on. It looks very suspicious if I'm not a writer of thrillers.
Yes, yes. And to our government overlords watching, please don't come for me.
Yeah.
In any case.
God bless America. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
So now the next question I have is that you are also one of the leading people in the Horror Writers of America.
Yeah, I'm on the board there at the Horror Writers Association, and I'm also a 5-time Bram Stoker Award winner, which is
Yes, you are.
It's actually kind of led me to being on the board because they said, well, you're getting a level of celebrity and so on. How about coming help running the organization? I love the HWA. It's a great organization. It does a lot to mentor people. It does a lot of work with libraries and schools for education. And it celebrates horror in all of its various forms. People who don't know horror think horror is just slasher movies and tearing out throats. And it's not. I mean, there's everything from the subtlest little bit of horror all the way up to the most, visceral splatterpunk and thousands of iterations in between. There's something for everyone. I mean, A Christmas Carol is a horror story.
Movie. Yeah.
Yeah. And also we include the more visceral thriller stuff like Silence of the Lambs won the Bram Stoker Award for Novel of the Year. But so did Lovely Bones when it won for Best First Novel. It just shows the range of what horror can do. And I love being part of the organization. I'm the MC for the Bram Stoker Awards.
Very nice.
Hopefully we'll be doing that live in Denver in 2021. But I love the organization because it does a lot of good, not just for writers who have been established, but for people who are trying to break in. Mm-hmm. Their philosophy, which I heartily endorse, is it's not a competition out there. It's a playground that's really big, and if there's more kids having fun, the readers are going to come and want to play in that playground.
Yeah, more toys to bang together is a lot of fun.
Even if that toy is a cardboard box that I'm making into a spaceship, come and play.
That's how I did it.
And speaking of spaceships, by the way, one of my other science fiction novels was a YA straight novel about the first families moving to Mars.
That's Mars One, right?
Mars One, yeah. And the science in it is rock solid. I worked with people at NASA and SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and so on to make sure my science was rock solid.
Oh, spectacular. And I find all of the, multi-genre authors are sadly sometimes a little bit rare. And I love to see multi-genre authors like yourself who are branching out into areas that otherwise I think that an agent or a publisher would go, no, come back. But I love it. Can you say that some of your work in horror is able to translate out into your science fiction and versa versa?
Yeah, and before I get to that, my history with multi-genre starts with advice I got from one of the great horror writers and science fiction writers of our age. When I was a kid, I was mentored, I became friends with and mentored for about 3 years off and on by Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson. And Matheson's books, pretty much don't fit on the same shelf. I Am Legend, Stir of Echoes, What Dreams May Come, Somewhere in Time, The Shrinking Man. He was all over the place.
Yes, he was.
Wrote he loved and then figured a way to sell it. And he advised me as a kid, don't write yourself into a corner. Write the story, that you want to write. And Bradbury added to that, write the stories you would go out of your way to read. I'm writing for my inner geek, and I read all over the place. One day I might be reading a novel about the Peninsular War, with Napoleon and the British Allies, and the next day I might be reading an old Ben Bova science fiction novel, and then go to a horror, a 19th century horror novel. I jump all over, so I write all over. That's so awesome. When I moved into the space of doing this, I wanted to be able to write what I wanted but it took a while to find the agent who said, "Oh yeah, that sounds fun." Because you're right, a lot of agents do like to keep their writer in a box because most agents are only as good as the editors they have on speed dial, and many of them specialize. But my agent, Sarah Crow, even though she has since specialized in middle grade and YA, handles no matter what I write, and is constantly encouraging me to write in different genres, because when those books come out, they don't compete with one another. Like so, my next book, Kagan the Damned, that came out actually from an editor who edits my stuff. Like he edits my Joe Ledger series, which is weird science action. He edits my Dead of Night series, which is horror science fiction, because it's a zombie story, but it's based on straight horror, straight science fiction rather, which is the plague. It's a parasitic based plague in that. And I give the science for it. But it's also a political story. So it's multi-genre within that book. And I do that a lot, bringing my horror and science fiction into the same camp. Because I technically everything I write is a thriller. So it might be a science fiction horror thriller. It might be a science fiction action thriller. It might be, whatever, even the epic fantasy I'm about to write is going to be based on a thriller. There's a race against time.
Very nice.
But the epic fantasy came about because my editor at St. Martin's, which is a imprint of Macmillan, reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you have any interest in writing, epic fantasy?" As it turns out, I do.
There you go.
First novel I ever bought with my own money was Conan the Wanderer.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and I was friends with another writer I was friends with as a kid was Sprague de Camp, the guy who brought Conan back after its long absence.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I've had a long interest in epic fantasy, and I read a lot of it.
Awesome. So we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask two very quick questions. First of all, for aspiring authors out there and those who want to up their game, any words of wisdom in terms of what they are building and developing?
Yeah, a couple things. It's not always great advice that people want to hear, but it's great advice that they should probably listen to. Is stop relying on just whatever natural storytelling gifts you have. That's great, but it's not enough. Learn the craft. Go the extra mile to go to writers' conferences, take courses, learn the elements of craft, because the more of that you learn, the better you are at taking your story and transforming it into something that will sell and reach readers. That's one thing. Right. Second, stop buying into the belief of that writer's block is a thing. It's not. It's a light label we give to a lot of different challenges within writing, each of which has a solution. So if you don't know where to go with your story, well, one of the solutions is read books like Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones about how to plot. If your characters are not becoming alive enough, go to Donald Moss's Writing the Breakout Novel Workbook and do the exercises to find the way into the character's personality and nuance. Each of these has a solution, but you have to stop believing in the mythology writer's block and try to identify what it is that's blocking you, and then go look for a solution. And also, I'm a big fan of being relentless. No matter what people tell you to do, if you want to write. Yes, they tell you it's hard. Yes, they tell you there are challenges. Well, there's challenges in everything. I mean, if you want to become a pilot, a lot of challenges there too. Doesn't mean that you won't rise to that challenge. Give it your whole heart, even though you may not have a support system standing behind you, patting you on the back and applauding. That whole heart response fuels your passion. And if you write with that passion, it'll show up in your writing. No matter how dark your material gets, it shows up in there and it makes that writing come alive.
Excellent. And
also, sorry to interrupt, one little thing. If you go to my webpage, jonathanmaberry.com, and it's Maberry, M-A-B, not M-A-Y-B, there's a subpage in there called Free Stuff for Writers. Has all sorts of files that are downloadable, how to write an outline, how to write a synopsis, comic book script samples, and just tons of stuff. Go get what you need. It's all free.
Excellent. And finally, I wanted to ask you, where can we find your work so that people who are interested in buying your books or getting a new book from you or so on, where can they go?
Well, I mean, to find out what I write, go to my website, because it lists everything. And I'm also on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Snapchat. So I'm easy to find, all under my name. But if you want to get any of my books signed, Mysterious Galaxy Bookstore in San Diego stocks all of my stuff. It's my local store, so I can just put on a mask, go down there. I was down there 2 weeks ago and signed a few hundred books that people had ordered. So just order. They'll tell me whether they have something that needs to be signed and personalized. I'll go down and get it, and I'll take care of it. And if you order a Joe Ledger book, by the way, it also comes with a cool patch from that's the organization he was in for the first 10 books. So we have that limited edition patch that they're sending with those books. Yeah.
All right. All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you so much for being involved with Ring of Fire Con. And everybody here, thank you for listening to the Spotlight Panel with John Maberry.
And thanks, Alexi. This is great. And thanks, Eric, for the Ring of Fire conference. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good day, guys.